Welcome on in, everyone. It's Malliem back with another weekly horror story. If you've got a story you'd like to share, feel free to post it to my subreddit linked below. Today's story is called, I took a security job watching a staircase in the woods. I thought it was a joke, until something used it. If you enjoy the show, hit that sub button for me. It helps a lot. Thanks! The ad didn't say what I'd be watching. It said site security, remote location, overnight shifts. Must be comfortable with extended periods of solitude. Pay was $28.50 an hour, cash equivalent, direct deposit every Friday. I'd been doing warehouse security for 3 years at that point. Walking the same 400 feet of shelving from midnight to 6, badging in forklifts, signing off on manifests. And I was tired in a way that warehouse fluorescents make you tired. The kind of tired that gets into the back of your eyes and stays there. So, I applied. The interview was a phone call. A man named Garrett, no last name offered, asked me if I had a problem being alone in the dark for 8 hours at a stretch. I said no. He asked if I startled easily. I said no. He asked if I could follow a specific list of operational procedures without improvising. I paused on that one longer than I meant to, and he said, "Good." The pause means you actually thought about it. He emailed me an offer letter that afternoon. I signed it and sent it back. There was a non-disclosure agreement attached, 4 pages, boilerplate looking. I read the first page and skimmed the rest, which I now know was stupid. But at the time I figured it was just liability coverage for a contractor with more lawyers than sense. He mailed me a physical packet 2 days later. Inside was a laminated ID badge, a map to the access road with gate codes handwritten in pencil, and a single sheet of paper printed in 12-point Times New Roman. Site operational procedures. Night shift. 8 rules. I read them standing at my kitchen counter with a cup of coffee going cold next to my elbow, and my first thought was that someone's legal team had worked very hard to cover a very boring job. My second thought, which I pushed away quickly, was that the rules didn't read like legal coverage. They read like someone had written them because they needed to exist. The first rule said not to step onto the staircase after sunset. The second said to confirm visually before logging any sounds from the structure. The third said if someone was already on the stairs, stay inside the booth. The fourth said not to respond to anyone speaking from the staircase. The fifth said if the top landing appeared closer than it should, stop looking at it. The sixth was the 2:13 a.m. lights off rule. 1 minute exactly. The seventh said if anything descended the stairs, do not follow it into the tree line. The eighth said if I lost sight of the staircase, report it immediately. I read all 8 twice. They had the specific quality of instructions written by someone who had seen things happen and was trying to prevent those things from happening again. And they were dressed up in neutral procedural language, the same way a warning label is dressed up as a suggestion. I put the sheet in a drawer and went to work. The access road was 1.5 miles of gravel off a state forestry route, gated at the entrance with a heavy padlock and a camera mounted on a post that looked recent, the housing still clean. I punched in the code, drove through, relocked it behind me. The tree line on both sides was Douglas fir, old growth. The trunks thick enough that headlights didn't penetrate more than 10 or 15 feet before the dark closed back in. The road was rough but maintained. Someone had graded it not long ago. The gravel packed and level. No washouts. The clearing opened up without warning. 1 second trees, then suddenly space. Maybe 80 feet across, roughly oval, with a prefab security booth sitting on a poured pad near the near edge, and the staircase on the far side, 40-something feet away, lit from underneath by 2 ground-mounted fixtures that someone had already switched on. I sat in the truck for a minute with the engine running and looked at it. It was a metal staircase. 3 flights, switchback style, the kind you see on the exterior of industrial buildings or parking structures. Gray painted steel, tube railings, diamond plate treads. It rose to about 30 feet, maybe a little more, with a landing at each turn and a final platform at the top roughly the size of a king mattress. The concrete footing it was anchored to was poured clean and level. The whole thing looked like it had been installed correctly, by people who knew what they were doing, following a standard spec. And it wasn't attached to anything. Nothing to explain why a staircase needed to go up 30 feet in a forest clearing. The fir trees behind it were at least 60 feet tall, and they just stood there being trees. And the staircase just stood there, being a staircase. And the disconnect between those two things took a few seconds to fully register, because your brain keeps looking for the building and keeps not finding it. I got out of the truck. The air was cold, mid-October, and it smelled like wet bark and pine resin, and that particular forest smell that isn't quite any single thing. I pulled my jacket closed and walked toward the booth first. It was small but functional, maybe 8 by 10, prefab construction, the kind of thing you rent for construction sites. Generator mounted outside on a concrete pad, already running, with a low hum that I could feel more than hear. Inside, a folding table, 2 chairs, a space heater with cracked housing, a logbook in a plastic sleeve, a 2-way radio on a charging dock, and a mini fridge with a handwritten note taped to it that said, "Keep stocked. Petty cash and envelope under table." The envelope had $60 in it. There was a window facing the clearing, the staircase visible dead center from the chair, and a solid door with a push-bar handle and no exterior lock. I checked the logbook. The previous entries were sparse, written in different hands, mostly just times and weather conditions and single-line observations. No activity. Quiet night. Wind from the north, some branch movement, nothing on the stairs. The last entry was 4 days ago. I flipped back a few pages, scanning. The entries went back about 8 months, though there were gaps, some stretches of a week or 2 with nothing. I didn't read them carefully. I should have. Then I went and looked at the staircase. I walked a full circuit around it, the way you'd walk around a car you're thinking about buying. The ground-level fixtures threw light up through the graded treads and made a grid of shadows across the grass around the base. Up close, the steel smelled like cold metal and a little bit of oil, the kind of maintenance smell that means someone is still coming around to keep it from rusting. The bolts of the footing were sunk deep, the concrete around them clean and uncracked. I crouched down and looked underneath. Just open air and grass, and the bolt flanges, and nothing else. There was a manufacturer's plate riveted to the inner face of the first stair stringer. Stamped metal, partly obscured by paint. I got my phone out and used the flashlight. The stamp read, Ferris Fabrication, Unit 7 of 12. Spec Series 4400. Below that, a date. I almost wrote it down in my head, but then didn't, which I still think about sometimes. I stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked up. The top landing was up there, 30 feet above, open to the sky, the grid of the platform just visible against the dark. It looked like a normal distance. I put my foot on the first tread, just resting it there, and I thought about stepping up. Not for any real reason, just the specific human reflex of, here is a staircase and I have feet. And then I thought about Rule 1, and I took my foot back. I told myself it was laziness. I wasn't ready to admit I'd already started treating the rules like they meant something. I went back to the booth and poured coffee from my thermos. Stanley, green, dented on one side from dropping it in a parking garage 2 years ago. And I sat in a chair facing the window, and I watched a staircase in a forest do absolutely nothing for 8 hours. I logged the temperature at the top of each hour. I logged no activity 4 times. I ate a gas station sandwich around 2 a.m. that had turkey in it that I wasn't entirely sure was turkey. My phone had 1 bar of signal that came and went, enough to scroll but not enough to load video. So I read things in pieces, half an article at a time, losing the thread when the signal dropped. At 2:13, I turned off the booth lights for 1 minute, because the rule was there and I had nothing better to do, and sat in the dark and looked at the staircase and the ground light glow and thought, okay, that's that, and turned them back on. I drove home at 6 a.m. when the sky was going gray-pink. I slept until noon. Nothing about it felt worth thinking about. On the drive in for the second shift, I stopped at a gas station for a bag of chips and another coffee, and stood at the counter for a minute trying to remember if I'd mentioned to anyone where I was working. I hadn't. The NDA was part of it, but also I hadn't had a conversation with anyone in about 4 days that went longer than a transaction. The guy at the counter asked if I wanted a receipt, and I said no, and drove the rest of the way out to the forest without the radio on. The second shift, I noticed the quiet. I'd been aware of it on the first shift in a background kind of way. No owls, no rodents in the grass, no deer moving at the clearing's edge. But I'd filed it under unfamiliar location. Give it time. On the second shift, I started actively listening for something and not finding it. The generator hummed. The space heater ticked. Beyond those 2 sounds, after about 10 o'clock, there was essentially nothing. The trees didn't move enough to rustle. Whatever lived in that forest was either very still or not close. I was staring at my phone, half reading something about a bridge collapse in another country, when I heard it. Metal. A faint sound, like a single footstep on a grated tread, a particular tone of diamond plate steel under weight. It lasted maybe half a second. I looked up at the staircase. Nothing. The structure sat in its ground light pool, completely still, every line exactly where it should be. I looked at the trees behind it. I looked at the ground around the base. I looked at the landings in sequence, bottom to top. Nothing. The trees were barely moving. I checked the time. 11:47. I sat there for another few minutes with my coffee getting cold on the table, and the sound didn't repeat. And eventually I opened the logbook and wrote, 11:47 p.m. Single metallic sound. Origin unclear. Visual check, negative. Wind minimal. No activity on structure. I felt slightly stupid writing it down. But the rule said confirm visually before logging, not only log things you can explain. So I logged it. I went back to my phone. 20 minutes later, I noticed I'd been staring at the same paragraph without reading it, and put the phone face down on the table. The top of the staircase looked normal. I had to establish that in my own head, methodically, because something about the landing wasn't sitting right in my peripheral vision, and I needed to look at it directly to check. When I looked directly at it, it looked fine. Same height, same distance, the top platform where it had always been. But for a moment, maybe 2 seconds while I was still in my peripheral, it had seemed closer. Like the proportions of the whole structure had shifted slightly, compressing, pulling the top down toward me. It was the kind of visual slip you get when you've been staring at one thing too long, the way a word starts to look wrong if you read it enough times. I looked away from the stairs and rubbed my eyes and looked at the wall of the booth for a while. At 2:13, I switched off the booth lights. Sitting in the dark, looking out at the clearing, the ground-mounted fixtures were still on, throwing their wash of light up through the treads, and the staircase was visible, all 3 flights of it, the lines of the railings and the grid shadows on the grass. Normal. I was thinking about whether I'd remembered to pay my electric bill. I was pretty sure I had, but not completely sure. When I registered something and had to backtrack to figure out what it was. The staircase was clear. Sharply clear. I could see the individual bolts on the railing posts, the seam lines on the diamond plate, a small bird dropping on the second flight handrail that I hadn't noticed before. In the dark, with the booth lights off, I was seeing the structure more clearly than I had all night with the lights on. I sat with that for the rest of the minute, not moving. When I turned the booth lights back on, the staircase went back to normal visibility, the fine details fading into the general lit shape of the thing. I didn't write it down. I thought about writing it down for a long time and then didn't. Instead, I wrote, 2:13 a.m. Lights off procedure completed. No activity. I closed the logbook and told myself the dark adaptation thing was just my eyes adjusting, and the apparent clarity was the contrast between the interior light and the exterior fixtures, and that was a physically reasonable explanation that I held on to very deliberately for the rest of that shift. On the drive home, I turned the heat up high and kept the radio on loud. The third shift, I kept the lights on at 2:13. I decided the rule was a conditioning exercise of some kind. Get the security guard into a habit of sensory disruption so they stay alert. And I decided I didn't need it. I sat in the booth with the lights on and watched the staircase and drank the rest of my coffee and felt fine about my decision for approximately 40 minutes. Then I heard the footsteps. Not one this time. Paced footsteps, 3 or 4 of them, the sound of weight coming down on metal stairs in a deliberate rhythm. A human weight. The sound had that specific quality, the slight flex in the tread before it takes the load, the way the whole structure adjusts a fraction under the pressure. I'd heard that exact sound on the exterior stairs in my old warehouse hundreds of times. I looked at the staircase. Someone was standing on the second landing. They were facing mostly away, angled toward the tree line, wearing a dark hoodie and what looked like work boots, Carhartt style, the heavy kind, lace-up, average height. They were completely still, weight on their left foot, one hand resting on the railing, like they'd stopped mid-step and just stayed there. My brain ran through the obvious options immediately and automatically. Trespasser, someone messing with me, a worker who hadn't been notified of the night security shift. All of those felt thin even as I was generating them. The road was locked. The clearing was not on any trail. But I ran through them anyway because they were available. Rule 3 said, if someone is already on the stairs, remain inside the booth. I stayed inside the booth. I watched. The figure didn't move for almost 2 minutes. I was counting, tapping my finger on my knee. 1 1,000, 2 1,000. And then they turned slightly. Not all the way. Maybe 20 degrees, just enough to make the turn visible, but not enough to bring their face into any kind of profile. The movement was slow and specific, like they were listening for something. Then the voice came. It carried across the clearing without being loud, the way sound sometimes travels in very still air. The phrasing was flat, conversational, not calling out. Hey, you're not supposed to be in there. My hand was already on the door push bar. I had the actual physical pressure of it against my palm, the cool steel of it, and I was maybe a pound of a force away from pushing it open and saying something back. Something like, "I work here," or "You need to leave." And I stopped because of Rule 4. Not because I believed in Rule 4. Just because the pressure of having memorized it was still there, and it stopped the impulse before I finished having it. I pulled my hand off the bar and stepped back. When I looked out the window again, the second landing was empty. I hadn't heard anything. No footsteps retreating, no creak of the structure under shifting weight. Nothing. The staircase was still and lit and completely unoccupied. I stood at the window for a long time. Then I went to the logbook and wrote the entry. Hands not totally steady, the pen making my handwriting slightly worse than usual. I wrote it factually. Time, location, description of the figure, the words I heard, my decision not to respond, the absence of the figure when I looked again. I read it back, and it looked like the report of a person who was handling things fine, which I believed less each time I read it. I sat back down in the chair and stared at the stairs until sunrise. The next shift, there were boot prints at the base of the structure. I noticed them when I arrived, walking my opening check circuit. They were pressed into the soft ground at the bottom of the first step. The soil there was slightly damp, the impression clear. The tread pattern was a heavy work boot, deep lugs, the kind of print that has some weight behind it. There were 2 prints, both left feet, side by side, angled toward the first stair, like someone had been standing there, deciding whether to go up. No prints approaching, no prints leaving. Just those 2 impressions in the soil at the base of the step, and the clean grass around them undisturbed. I walked the perimeter of the clearing. Nothing. I looked for tire tracks in the gravel of the access road. Nothing new. I went back to the booth and sat down, and looked at the staircase, and the top landing seemed like the normal distance, and I was grateful for that. So I noted it mentally and looked away before I could look too long. I didn't ignore the 213 rule this time. I turned the lights off and sat in the dark for the full minute, and I didn't look at the stairs with any particular intention. I just let them be there at the edge of my vision. And they were fine. Just a staircase. When I turned the lights back on, I exhaled a breath I hadn't totally been aware I was holding. I wrote up the boot prints in the log. I radioed in on the check-in frequency and told whoever was on the other end, a man who gave his name as T, just the initial, that I'd found trace evidence of an unauthorized visitor and asked if I should file a formal incident report. T said, "You logged it?" I said yes. He said, "That's the report. Good work," and signed off. I sat with the radio in my hand after that, not totally sure what I'd expected him to say. I want to be careful about how I describe what happened on the 5th shift, because I've told this account in my head many times, and the part I always get wrong is the sequence. The temptation is to put things in an order that makes them feel inevitable, building from one to the next. But that's not how it happened. What happened was, it was a slow night, and I was tired, and my phone battery was at 11% because I'd forgotten to charge it, and I was sitting in the chair with the logbook open in my lap, writing nothing in particular, just keeping my hand moving so I'd stay awake, when I heard something on the stairs. Something coming down, but slowly. One sound, then a pause that ran a beat too long, then another sound, the gaps between steps stretching and compressing without pattern. Heavy. The weight landing each time with a quality I couldn't name right away. Something off in the distribution of it. like each step was being worked out independently from the one before. I looked up. Something was on the second flight, coming down. I registered the shoes first because they were at my eye level. Dark, lace-up, the heavy kind. Then the legs. Then the rest of it. And here is where I run into the problem of description, because what I saw was a figure in dark clothing, proportioned like a person, carrying itself approximately the way a person carries itself. And if you'd shown me a photograph of it, I think you could have argued it was just someone walking down a staircase. But the photograph wouldn't have shown you the way it moved. The shoes landed slightly off-center on each tread. Not dramatically, maybe an inch and a half off from where you'd put your foot if you were walking down a staircase normally. Each time it hit a step, it took an extra fraction of a second to settle, like it was working out the distribution each time fresh, like it was running a small calculation. The intervals between steps didn't have the rhythm of someone being careful. They had the rhythm of something that had learned the sequence, but hadn't fully internalized it yet. I didn't move. I was aware that I wasn't moving, and I couldn't fully account for why, whether it was the rules or something more basic. I watched it come down the last flight. It stepped off the bottom stair onto concrete footing and stood there for a moment. And then it turned and started walking across the grass toward the booth. I heard the gravel when it hit the gravel apron around the booth. That specific crunch, stones pressing under weight. I could see it through the window as it came closer, the ground lights now behind it, its outline going from bright to dim as it moved out of the light zone. It walked like it knew where it was going. 12 feet out. 10 feet. The shape of it gaining definition through the glass. The hood up. The hands at its sides, the posture slightly too upright. Like someone doing an impression of casual. It stopped just outside the door. 2 taps. Knuckles on the door panel, light and even. The same knock you'd use on a coworker's office door when you didn't want to startle them. Polite. Specific. I sat in the chair and looked at the door and felt something happen in my chest that I won't dramatize. My whole body had gone to a particular kind of still. And then I did the wrong thing. I don't have a good reason for it. I've tried to reconstruct the decision, and what I find is that the knock was so ordinary that it routed me around the rules. It went straight past the part of my brain that had been holding them and hit the part that was just a person in a booth hearing someone knock. My hand was on the push bar before I'd caught up with myself. I opened the door halfway. 6 inches of cold air came in. I looked at the thing standing outside my booth in the dark and said, "You're not supposed to be out here." The head tilted, slow, a degree or two, the way a person tilts their head when they're considering something. I couldn't see the face inside the hood. What I could see was the shape of the jaw, the curve of a chin, the general structure of a face, but the interior of the hood stayed dark in a way that didn't entirely line up with how dark it was outside. It said, "You're not supposed to be out here." The words were mine. The exact cadence, the pause between supposed and to, the slight flatness I have when I'm trying to sound authoritative and not quite landing it. My voice played back at me from inside a hood in a forest clearing at 3 a.m. I slammed the door. The push bar hit the frame and I put both hands on the door and stepped back. It hit the chair with the back of my legs and went down sideways. And the thermos went off the table and hit the floor. And the lid wasn't on tight and coffee spread across the boards in a dark fan shape. And I sat on the floor next to the tipped chair and looked at the door. Silence. The generator hummed. The space heater ticked. I got up slowly and looked out the window. The clearing was empty. The staircase sat in its light, all 3 flights visible and still. No figure by the door. No figure crossing the grass. No shape moving at the tree line. I picked up the thermos and put it on the table and stood there for a while with coffee soaking into the rubber sole of my boot. I checked the stairs before I left that morning. I told myself I was doing it because the procedure said to document physical evidence, and that was the only reason. The treads had marks on them. Not random. They ran along the outer edge of several steps on the bottom flight, scuffed marks in the gray paint, the kind that come from something dragging across the edge of the step at an angle. Repeated by the look of it. The paint was worn back to bare metal in places, and the edges of the marks were irregular, not the clean line you get from a tool or a single deliberate scrape. Something had come across those edges many times. I crouched down and looked at the ground. Footprints in the soft earth leading from the base of the stairs toward the booth. And from the booth, a second set heading back toward the stairs. The prints going out were the heavy work boot tread that I'd seen before. The prints coming back matched them exactly. The size, the depth, the wear pattern on the heel. A slight drag on the left toe. I knew those marks. I have a habit of not fully lifting my left foot when I'm tired, dragging the toe just slightly. I've worn through the left toe of 3 pairs of shoes that way. I stood up and looked down at my feet. Work boots, Wolverine brand. The pair I'd been wearing all week. I turned around and walked to the booth door and opened it and looked at the gravel apron immediately outside. My prints were there, coming out of the booth, crossing the gravel, then on the grass, then the path to the stairs, then back again. I hadn't walked that path tonight. I had driven in, done my opening circuit of the perimeter, and gone into the booth, and I had been in the booth since. I was sure of that, the way you're sure of things you haven't examined too closely. I looked at the prints for a while in the early morning light. Then I went back inside. I wrote for a while before I thought to flip back and check the previous entries, just to have the context of what I'd already logged. About 12 pages back from the current date, I found an entry written in my handwriting. The date was from before I was hired. The pen was the same pen I'd been using. Same black ink. Same slight skip in the line that happens when the ball catches. And the handwriting was mine. The same slightly cramped cursive I use when I'm writing fast. The entry was 4 words. It learned faster this time. I turned back another page. Another entry, a different date, still before my hire date, still my handwriting. 2 sentences about the weather and the sound of something on the stairs, and a visual check that found nothing. I kept flipping. There were more. Not every page. They were scattered through the book among entries in other hands. But they were there, spaced out over months, sometimes a line, sometimes a paragraph. All in my handwriting. All dated before I existed at this job. I sat there with a logbook open across my knees for a long time, the generator running outside, the space heater ticking, the coffee stain on the floor dried now to a brown outline. I didn't radio it in. I thought about calling Garrett and didn't do that either. Instead, I sat there until the sky started going light, and then I drove home and slept badly for 5 hours, and lay in bed staring at the water stain on my ceiling that's been there since the apartment above me had a pipe burst 2 years ago. I went back. I keep telling myself there's a reason for that, something rational. The money, the contract, the non-disclosure agreement I barely read. And those things are true. But I also think I went back because I needed to know if it had happened the way I remembered it. And the only way to check was to go back and sit in that chair and look at that staircase and see if everything still held the same shape it had the night before. It had gotten worse. The booth was exactly as I'd left it, except for one thing. There was a new entry in the logbook, at the top of the current page, above the entries I'd made on the previous shift. Written in my handwriting. Timed at 4:47 a.m., which was after I'd already driven home. I hadn't written it. Responded to a knock. Door opened. 6 seconds. Significant progress. Response time improving. I read it 3 times. I turned the page and checked the next entry, which was mine, definitely mine, written in the unsteady hand I'd had when I was on the floor next to the tip chair. I could see the place where the pen had pressed harder because my hand was shaking. I sat down in the chair and looked at the staircase. It looked completely normal. The ground lights on, the structure sitting in its clearing, the top landing at the right distance. I checked that specifically. The top landing looked right. The proportions were right. The distance was what it should be. I let out a slow breath. Then I noticed the dirt on the first step. Fresh, dark dirt on the diamond plate tread, the kind that transfers from wet ground when something walks across it. It was on the first step only. The concrete footing below it was clean. The ground around the footing was undisturbed. I looked at it for a long time from inside the booth. The dirt was on the top surface of the tread, which meant it had come from above. Someone, or something, carrying soil on their shoes and depositing it on the way down. Not on the way up. Which meant whatever had put it there had started higher up on the staircase. I tried to think about where you'd go from the top of a staircase that led nowhere, and came up empty. I looked down at my own boots. The boots I'd been wearing. The left toe had fresh soil on it, dark and wet, pressed into the seam between the sole and the upper. I sat very still in the chair and tried to locate the last clear memory I had of being inside the booth, specifically, the last moment I could account for without a gap. I found 4:30-something, a vague memory of the logbook, the lights on, the window, the staircase in the distance looking fine. And then there was a seam. And on the other side of it was morning, and I was in my apartment and my boots were by the door, with something dark on the left toe that I'd looked at briefly and filed away as mud from the access road. I thought about that seam in my memory. It wasn't like forgetting. Forgetting has a texture, a gradual fade, a sense of things getting fainter as you approach the edge. This was clean. One thing, then another thing, and nothing in between. I thought about the logbook entry timed at 4:47, which was 30 minutes into what should have been my drive home. I thought about that second set of footprints I'd found, the ones leading away from the booth toward the stairs, both sets identical. Mine. Outside the window, in the clearing, the staircase sat and did nothing, which was worse than if it had done something, which was the thing I kept finding out. That the stillness was worse, that the empty structure in its pool of ground light was the part that settled into your chest and took up residence there and didn't have a name you could use to get it out again. I opened the logbook. I uncapped the pen. I wrote the date and the time and on shift. And then I looked at the line below it for a long time. Then I wrote, first step, fresh soil transfer on tread. Origin above. No prior activity logged this shift. I read it back. I checked it for accuracy. Everything was accurate. I looked up the staircase, and I looked at the first step, and I looked at my boot, and I looked at the logbook and at the pen in my hand. And somewhere in the middle of that circuit, something got very quiet inside me. The specific quiet of a conclusion you've been circling for a long time, finally sitting down. I didn't write what I was thinking. I didn't know how to write it in a way that would fit in a logbook, in a way that could sit next to the weather observations and the hourly temperature readings and the no-activity notions of whoever had sat in this chair before me. The thought wasn't the right shape for a log entry. What I thought was, the handwriting is mine. The boot prints are mine. The dirt is mine. And I don't know where I've been. Outside, in the clearing, the staircase was completely still. I kept my eyes on the bottom step and did not look at the top landing, because Rule 5 said, if the top landing appears closer than it should be, stop looking at it. And I found, sitting there in the small booth with the generator humming and the morning coming gray-white through the trees, that I had run out of reasons to treat the rules like they didn't mean anything. There was something on the first step, and I had no clean explanation for it, and the logbook had my handwriting in it from dates that hadn't happened yet for the person I thought I was. And the footprints in the soil around the structure matched the boots on my feet, and something had knocked on my door with my own cadence and spoken with my own voice. I picked up the radio. I keyed it. I said, "This is the night post. I need to speak with Garrett." My voice sounded normal, which surprised me enough that I stopped for a second and tried to feel my way around inside myself to see what was happening in there. I found something. A kind of weight, low and settled, without edges, taking up space in a way that hadn't been there before the fifth shift, and was there now, and was going to stay there. The radio clicked. T's voice. "Garrett's not available. Log everything." I waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. The channel went back to static. I set the radio down on the table next to the logbook and the cold thermos and the pen with a slight skip in its ball, and I looked out the window at the staircase. The first step, specifically. The dirt on the first step, which was still there, which would still be there when whoever came after me arrived for their shift. If there was someone who came after me. I didn't actually know if there was. I'd never seen anyone at the handoff. I just drove in and they were gone, and I'd assumed there was a day shift somewhere, or that the structure didn't need eyes during daylight hours, or that the handoff just didn't overlap. I'd never thought to ask. I looked at the logbook, at my handwriting running down the page, at the date and the time and the words I'd written, and below them, the line I hadn't written yet. I thought about all the entries further back in the book, the scattered ones, months deep, my hand in unfamiliar ink that turned out to be the same ink, My pressure on the page that turned out to be my pressure. All that documentation of things I had supposedly witnessed, written by a version of me that had been sitting in this chair before I knew the chair existed. It learned faster this time. Present tense, past action. Someone had been in a hurry. I looked at the staircase. I logged everything.